Fetch Phillips at the very end still doesn't really solve anything. He just gets beat up and then escapes. A man for hire haphazardly tries to solve a missing persons case while reminiscing about his past. Their disappearances might be related, but our man for hire has to get super drunk first and tell us about the wondrous fantasy world he lives in and how he single-handedly destroyed it. While clues randomly fall into his lap, our man for hire turns into a real estate mogul to secure a bit of property. And oh yeah, the missing vampire, no worries. Turns out he was at home the whole time.
I know. I really wasn't expecting that ending too.
So in the summary of the book, it says this book is like for readers of Jim Butcher and the Harry Dresden files, right? Which I can understand what its similarities because Harry Dresden is a detective. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of fantasy going on, but Harry Dresden is in modern day Chicago and there's magic and things happening. Whereas this Last Mile in Sunder City happens in a fantasy world where all kinds of magical creatures exist and are just running around everywhere. But it has all died. It's all gone away, or it is dying and withering. Mm-hmm. And in the middle of all of this is Fetch Phillips, and he is a detective essentially, but he says he's a man for hire, and he's trying to find out what happened to this vampire dude. Yeah. And I think that's the most interesting part, is the PI in this dying fantasy world. And I think of those two, the more interesting thing is the dying fantasy world. Because I think he really sets it up nicely, because although there's like a mystery he has to solve of where this vampire went, I think like 80% of the novel is really just Fetch Phillips telling us how the world is and why there's vampires and why there's fairies and how they're aging. There's even one scene where he goes to like a old folks home, like a retirement village, but it's really just like a retirement village for a bunch of vampires and elves, where in the past didn't age, right? So they were super powerful and strong and beautiful and whatnot, but now they're just like decrepit old monsters that are slowly dying. And that's, I haven't read anything like that before, and that was unique in this story, was this slow death of all the fantasy world where everything left is just going to be humans. That slow transition of the death of the fantasy world is interesting, but I thought that the mystery just wasn't that interesting, and it didn't seem like the author was that interested in even selling the intrigue of the mystery of what happened to this vampire.
But maybe because it wasn't really truly like what the story was supposed to be about, right? I think it was more of the setup of this entire world and all his world building as you go along, and him trying to, figure out what happened to the siren and the vampire. So I think it was more supposed to be about that.
I guess. And that's what I'm saying. Like, he puts very little effort into the mystery and the solving of the mystery.
But I think that's also like his personality, right?
Yeah,
and that's kind of, he feels like he's not really good at anything. He's not important. He kind of ruined the world in the first place.
Yeah, he was instrumental in ruining the world. Spoiler alert. Yeah. And that's, again, the most interesting part is learning his backstory. Yeah. Because the mystery, he doesn't even really solve it. It kind of all just falls in his lap. I think one time he's like either drunk or passed out or something, and then somebody just shows up out of nowhere and gives him clues to the mystery, which he then goes off to try to piece together, doesn't do it very well, and then comes back home. Once again, either gets knocked out or is drunk, and then another like gnome dude shows up and just like, oh yeah, here's some clues to the story. You've made no effort in solving this crime, so I will help you.
But I honestly feel like it helps you understand his personality. And I really liked him just as this guy going through life, super miserable, depressed, trying to do some good in some way, and like you said, not really having that clear path, just kind of weaving in and out of things.
Yeah, just meandering into the idea of doing good,
happening for him,
and then giving up halfway into doing good.
I don't know. It all works out at the end.
Because, like, okay, he gets on board with finding this vampire. And then, so I'm going to complain a lot about the mystery, right? Understand. Because this is sold as like a mystery story where really it's just like building of a fantasy world that'll continue in the rest of the series. Right. But this one is not really a mystery story. Like, it's barely a mystery. If you took out all the backstory or the world building, this would be like 20 pages of a mystery. Yes. And it wouldn't even be that good. It's a semi-noir mystery. But a vampire goes missing, right? The first thing Fetch does is leave the scene of the crime. Or at least not the scene of the crime, but the last place that the man was missing, right? Which was his home, kind of a library deal. Well, Fetch like kind of looks around and he's like,
Yeah,
all right,
I was
let me
just
go to
gonna
a bar.
say he did look around. He was rifling through papers. He even took the vampire's like work bag with all kinds of other paperworks in there. I think it was just difficult for him to kind of piece things together when all he had to go off of was he's a teacher and he has papers of his students that he needed to grade.
Yeah.
And like normal vampire stuff around in his home. Like there wasn't like blood. There wasn't
a trail. But that's what I'm
trail.
saying. Like, yeah, there wasn't much to go off of, but isn't your job as a detective to start finding clues, right? So in my eyes, the first thing you would have did was just ransack his house, basically. You're looking for all kinds of clues, right? Which he had access to. Then the second thing you want to do is start questioning everybody that had contact with him, especially in the last 24 to 48 hours. That would be a bunch of students. He never asked any students anything.
But I think because they didn't want him to. Remember the school, the principal told him, like, we kind of don't want to make this in a big
That's why he
deal.
didn't call the cops.
Yeah, so I think he was trying to do his best with what he had, and he didn't want to scare all these children who are their world is literally falling apart around them. They've never even known magic. They're these mythical weird creatures.
Yeah, they're like little baby elves and fairies. And
they're already afraid of like the world of death.
Which it was kind of like an Xavier school for like super mutants.
I know,
right?
I like that.
There's this one principal and he was collecting all of these little fairy or fantasy creatures and they were going to school there. That was very nice. Yeah. And I think you're right. Like he was trying to keep it up under wraps, but as a detective, you at least need to talk to one or two people that last saw him. And if he had did that, he would have found that one girl that was with him. He did it again by accident. Like he ended up...
No, he talked to the librarian lady who was like his really good friend who obviously, worked there. Okay, but he did talk to someone and she saw him a lot and he literally lived upstairs from the library. So like they were close. He talked to her. What else do you want from the guy? Good
and
Lord.
Then he finds like some stuff at an abandoned house, which fine, like how are you going to piece that all together? But he doesn't really like follow up on it. Like he follows up eventually later after like getting super drunk. And then...
Well, that always helps clear the mind. Takes your worries away so you can really focus.
And then we find out, spoiler alert, that if he had done his job in the beginning and had searched through the library properly,
I think so.
Questioned a few extra people, he would have found a dungeon at the bottom of the library that the vampire was in. He was there the whole time. Yeah. And I think in the story, you're supposed to be like, oh my God, he was back at home the whole time.
Okay, I did do that.
But how is that surprising? Like,
it was surprising to me because I was like, I mean, that wouldn't have been the place that I would have even
It was surprising because Fetch was a terrible detective.
Because
that's the only reason why it was surprising.
Because he's not technically a detective. He's just some dude who happens to do just weird jobs, side jobs, all these things.
And so he says he's a man for hire, so he's not a detective essentially.
You gotta give him a break because he doesn't really know
and he's essentially
how it all goes.
He's essentially on morphine throughout the whole thing, right? Because he says these little picks.
Those little cinnamon picks or something.
Morphine or something like that in it, and he's always chewing these little morphine sticks.
Some kind of spice, yeah.
Okay, so for comparing this to Harry Dresden, right, Jim Butcher, which the author does in his book summary, Jim Butcher, Harry Dresden is a legit detective, right? He goes to question people. He puts clues together.
It has the vibe.
And then there's like a resolution and Harry Dresden's putting it all together. And then there's like a huge climax at the end where Harry Dresden comes to the rescue and solves problems. Right?
But
in this one, Fetch Phillips at the very end still doesn't really solve anything. He just gets beat up and then escapes.
It was more like, if you like that kind of vibe, this also has that vibe, but it's its own thing. It's also different. He's not this Harry Dresden person.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of Harry Dresden, by the way.
Obviously. He's Luke Arnold writing this fantasy world with a little bit of those detective vibes.
Yeah.
He is not a full-blooded detective.
Yeah.
He's just a dude trying to get by with the life that he was given, and he's a human, so like, humans and all these mythical creatures don't necessarily get along, especially after what happened, getting rid of all the magic and them dying off, and then him being kind of at the forefront of all that. You know what I mean? He's just trying to just do the best he can with what he's got, which is not very much. And I appreciated him. I liked him as a character. And I forgave a lot of these little hiccups that he went through.
Yeah,
okay?
hiccups. Let's call them just hiccups.
Jeez,
right?
man, give him a break.
I hope the mystery gets better in future novels
Right.
because I will be back just for the world. Because this fantasy world he's building here is just so fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
And again, I find it fascinating not because like the fantasy is different than other fantasy novels. It's much the same. It's a lot of the same tropes, right? Vampires, elves,
Different
trolls,
dynamics.
and things like that. But what makes it interesting is that they're dying. The magic is gone and the world is dying.
But
and
there's
seeing
still
all of
these
these creatures
Yeah.
dealing with the loss of their magical powers is the most fascinating thing about this
Yeah,
story.
I think so too. And I'm hoping they end up getting the magic back at some point.
Yeah,
and
me too.
Bringing back to life the world itself.
Yeah,
But
because
I feel
the world, because he makes it so dark and sad
Yeah.
that these creatures lost their magic.
Mhm.
It's like as
But
if
it is,
all
I
of
think.
like the penguins and dolphins and whales of the world are just dying
Yeah.
and they will never be back, right?
Well,
Like,
I think that's true.
yeah, like in today where like all of these creatures are going extinct and we could
Mhm.
see them going extinct and pretty soon they're going to die
Mhm.
and they will never be back again. That's that same kind of feeling he's conjuring up in this fantasy world.
Yeah. And I like fantasy, so it's like, oh, this is just so cool.
Yeah, you and Priscilla both. I like a lot of science fiction, but well-written fantasy also draws me in. I think I also like urban fantasy, like contemporary fantasy.
Right. Me too.
I don't really like high fantasy
Oh, I like that
elf
stuff. I
type
love that.
stuff, like in another planet.
I like that.
I like how fantasy is integrated into my world.
Like
today.
what you can relate to
Yeah.
in a way.
If I
Like
can
it's
relate
still crazy, but like you can still relate. It's still grounded a bit.
like I like in the Harry Dresden books how Harry Dresden says like I can use magic, but there's no way to overcome the force of gravity. I'm like, what? You have magic, dude. You can do whatever you want. What are you talking about? He's like, no, physics still applies. I'm like,
Why? Yeah, why and how? I know. That's funny. I'm not super into like detective type murder mystery type of books, crime thrillers or whatever. For me, I think mostly why I read this, not only because it was, recommended to me, but I like the fantasy aspect. And that brought like something a little different for me. So maybe that's why I liked it more than you did, because that's more your vibe. But for me, I was like, oh, it has something a little different than I'm used to.
Yeah.
And I like it. Like maybe it's introducing me into that world of the real detective stuff. So I really liked it. I felt like it was totally different from what I normally read, which is like romance and fantasy and heavier on the romance. But this had like almost none. There is some kind of a story with some
which
woman.
surprised me. I could have swore he was gonna fall in love with somebody somewhere.
Exactly, because I recommended it to you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Read the recommendation. I'm like, oh Jesus, this is gonna be some kind of romance.
But there was none, really.
Yeah.
There was maybe a little of it. But
it's an inspiration, like a romance he had in the past inspires him to continue.
Right.
But there's no like
It's
hot and
not
heavy
about-
sex scene in here.
Yeah, it's not about that at all. There's zero kissing. There's zero like intimacy. I actually really enjoyed, surprisingly. So I love it.
It's no romance. It's just Fetch Phillips doing a terrible job at trying to find an aging
Yeah.
vampire.
And I know
Which
you said,
I guess you're okay with.
yeah, I'm okay
But
with.
if you're gonna sell this to me as a Harry Dresden type book, there needs to be a clear mystery to solve, a process to solving it, and a resolution that the protagonist takes part in.
Listen, Fetch is just doing the best he can. That's all I gotta say. Okay. Oh my God. I love some of his lines. Like the very last part was just like I got some stuff to do, but like first I'm just gonna drink this disgusting coffee.
Yeah, his witty one-liners and his very sharp observations of the world and how he describes things were all very interesting. Like I was always ready to get one of his like descriptors or like find out some way he sees the world, because most of the descriptions in the book are very witty and sharp and was so interesting and paints the world like in a particular point of view that only Fetch Phillips sees it.
Right. The interaction I mostly enjoyed was between him and the new restaurant owner. I honestly fell in love with that restaurant owner. What was he?
I don't know. I forget what kind of creature he was, because there's a lot of magical creatures. But to set this up, Fetch Phillips either lives above or next to a laundromat.
Yeah.
And a magical creature now runs the laundry shop, but is also a restaurateur, or trying to be. And he serves Fetch breakfast usually, and it's terrible.
Like really bad. But he's like so excited to see him try it, and he wants to be the best. He wants to serve delicious food. Like, you could see it emanating from every pore of his body, and he's just like, you don't like it. I will do better next time. Like, but he's so sweet too, and like just the way Fetch was like talking about him, the past life that he lived, and like how this is something he has zero experience in, but is so passionate about because this is like his new life. Just as they're all going through new things, new changes, developed. Because
now that the magic has lost the world, he used to be the restaurant owner, used to be like some high elf leader, wizard somewhere.
Someone super important.
Someone super important, basically like the president of the United Nations, kind of.
Right.
And now he's just a lowly restaurant owner trying to figure out how to cook some biscuits.
And I think that's why I like Fetch so much.
So you're drawn to Fetch, right? Because of these small, like, emotional moments, right? And you're like, oh man, Fetch is really a good dude at heart. But then he ends up kicking a bunch of, like, dwarfs out of their home and then relocating them with some shady developer so that Fetch can get a piece of land that we later find out his girlfriend's on. But he essentially, like, evicts all of these dwarves. It's a good juxtaposition between Fetch being good and kind of selfish.
Yeah,
right?
kind of doing things for his
It's not necessarily bad that he, like, kicks them off, but it is definitely selfish. And we're stuck with, like, this protagonist that's, like, in the middle. I'm not really sure if I like him or if I just like following him. You know what I mean? I think there's a difference. I don't think I like him. I think I like following him because he's interesting.
I really like him because not everybody's perfect. And I think at the core of him, for the most part, he is a good person who just had a really interesting hand dealt to him.
It's an interesting hand that was dealt to him, but it was through choices he made. It wasn't like,
but
this
even how he grew
me.
up, like he talked about how he grew up and things like that, things that were expected of him, and that can be difficult too. Maybe
that caused him to be a terrible person.
It could in some aspects,
destroy all the magic.
But then also too, can you blame him for wanting to buy the land for where the house is, where someone he loved in the past is there, so it's not ruined or she's not destroyed? He wants her to live, obviously, even if she's stoned. Like can you blame him? That's like part of his heart there.
And that's what I mean. Like, he's not 100% likable to me. Like, he is like 80 to 75% likable. Overall, just seems kind of like haphazardly going through life, occasionally doing nice things, but mostly being selfish.
That's your opinion.
All the track tapes are ready.
But did you